Good morning, friends. Good morning. I'm back, and we are continuing our series on the portraits of the Old Testament. So we are going to do all these portraits of the past in the continuing weeks. And last video and the video before that were about Adam and Eve and what happened to them in the garden. So this week I'm talking about the sons of Adam and Eve. This is the next generation. Adam and Eve are, I'm sure, hopeful that they're going to have good sons and they're going to have a wonderful next generation in the world. And this is what happens with the story of Adam and Eve's sons. This week, this is the second generation now. So we are chronologically going down through the generations. I know a lot of people are interested in genealogy and who they're related to. And I thought this would be a fun way to go through the Old Testament and see how we can actually realize those genealogies that are in Luke and Matthew in the New Testament. So this week we're going to talk about these sons. Now, they had never been in the garden. They don't have any inkling of the paradise their parents had left. Just like our children, they had to acquire a skill in order to make a living, and they had to work. Sin had already entered the world, and they had to work in this fallen existence. So in Genesis 4:1 in the NASB, it says, "Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have obtained a male child with the help of the Lord." Now this is where we get that idea that we children, when we receive children, they are a gift from God. Now, whether we actually bear them ourselves or whether we're fostering, adopting, whether we're babysitting, any of those things, they count as receiving a gift from God. Now, this is also where we get the idea that sex is reserved for marriage between a man and a woman, because sex is not only unitive in a marriage, it's reproductive. It doesn't always have to be reproductive, but it's united. So Cain is the firstborn child. We will see in Genesis 4:2 in the NASB. And again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. So Cain is born, and then she gives birth to his brother Abel. So she has two boys. I know what that's like. I have three boys. I have a sign in my kitchen right over here that says, "Mothers of little boys work from sun up to sundown." And the sun is not spelled S-U-N, it's spelled S-O-N. So I'm still working from sun up to sundown, and there's only one here at home in my home. So Eve was busy, and she raised them up. And in verse 2, it continues. They choose their professions. I have one son who went into drafting and design. I have another son who is in teaching and education. And I have one that is to see what he's going to do. But we see here that Abel is a keeper of the flocks. He chooses that profession. Cain is a cultivator of the ground. So we see Cain is a shepherd and Abel is a farmer. So maybe they didn't call it that back then, but that's basically what they were doing. Cain is a shepherd, Abel is a farmer. So now this is where it's prudent to remember what God did to clothe Adam and Eve in the garden. When they sinned, God had to kill at least one animal to clothe them in animal skin. Because if you remember, they were wearing fig leaves, and they weren't going to be any kind of permanent garment. So he killed at least one animal to clothe them with the skin. So this is where God instituted the sacrificial system for dealing with sin. And we will see this developing through the Old Testament. We will see that the starts of this sacrificial system start in verse 3 with Cain and Abel. So in the NASB, verse 3, so it came about, here comes my kitty. He likes to be on the camera. So it came about in the course of time. So this didn't come about exactly immediately. We don't know exactly how Adam and Eve passed down these traditions to Cain and Abel, but these were instituted by God, and we can see that all throughout the Old Testament, this is what God's people do. So it says in verse 3, so it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. Of course, he is a farmer. He has his crops and he has his orchards, and he is bringing fruit of the ground. So he's bringing vegetable or fruit. So verse 4, Abel on his part brought an offering from the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. So this was taught to them. Like I said, Adam and Eve taught them about God. Adam and Eve taught them about the garden, the serpent, the sin, the sacrifice. So they are well aware of what God expects and what God does not expect. So now they're carrying on this tradition of worshiping God by giving him offerings. This is the way they worship. So God's response in this from the NIV is, and the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain had done something wrong. And this was Cain's response. Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. So he was very upset. Instead of doing the right thing, he sat in those emotions and he sulked. And he didn't want to do what he was supposed to do. And I guess he decided that maybe God was going to let this slide. But God didn't. God didn't let it slide. Cain's offering was not accepted by God. God speaks with Cain and says, why are you angry and why is your face downcast? And this is a key verse. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Now, this is not accepted by people. This is accepted by God. We need to do that thing that God accepts. So we see Cain, he did not want to do what was right. And it implies Cain did indeed know what he did wrong. The Bible doesn't say exactly, though. I have two guesses. This is my two guesses. The first guess is that he didn't bring a quality sacrifice to God, meaning that the fruit that he had picked, either it wasn't the first fruit or it wasn't the best fruit that he had. My second guess, and this is the one that I favor, is that he wasn't supposed to bring fruit at all. He was supposed to bring a sacrifice like Abel brought. And of course, we remember what Abel brings is a offering from the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. I mean, if you read in the book of Leviticus, you will see that this is a rule. You will see that Abel's offering is a clue to Leviticus 3:6. If you read in there in the NASB, it says, but if his offering is a sacrifice of peace to the Lord, it's from the flock, and he shall offer it, male or female, without defect. And so these are the steps that he must take. He must slaughter it. He must sprinkle the blood on the altar. He shall then bring as an offering to the Lord's fire its fat. Okay, so this is what Abel did. I'm not saying that Abel already had the book of Leviticus. He didn't. This was written later by Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. So now we see, though, in Leviticus, a standard of what God expects. And we see Abel in Genesis doing this similar action. And back to Abel, this would have been a lot of work, but he would have chosen an animal, no defects. He would have slaughtered the animal, spread the blood on an altar, just stones that he assembled, nothing fancy or anything like that. And he would have burned these fat portions. And that's exactly what Abel did. So this was a bloody, messy business, but Abel did it. And then God tells Cain, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door, and it desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So, of course, Cain, we know the story, how it ends. Cain does not do what God wants him to do. He takes Abel out into the field, and he kills Abel, and God comes and finds Cain and says, what are you doing? What's going on? What happened to your brother? And he says, I don't know. What am I, my brother's keeper? And this is like dripping with sarcasm. Why do I have to be responsible for my brother? So we see that there was indeed friction right there between those two brothers over this sacrifice being accepted and not being accepted. So in verse 12, because of Cain's sin, he is cursed. His sin, it curses him. the consequences of his sin is the curse. God does not just curse you because you're not doing anything wrong. This sin comes about from the devil because of what he did wrong. So he can no longer be a farmer because the ground will no longer yield crops for him. And he is also, and this is the worst of it. This is the worst of it. He is sent from the presence of the Lord. Can you imagine growing up in the presence of the Lord all your life, and then all of a sudden you are abandoned out into the world, and you're no longer in the presence of God? This is what he did. This is what he did. The consequences of what he did. So Eve lost 2 sons in one day. She lost Abel to death, and she lost Cain to banishment. In verse 25, but we see God is always there redeeming each and every generation. So he is showing Eve that he is indeed going to redeem this generation also, and he is going to give her another child. In verse 25, Adam had relations with his wife Eve again. That's in NASB. She gave birth to a son and named him Seth, for she said, God has appointed me another child in place of Abel because Cain killed him. Now it says, this is the generation, and with Seth, this is the generation that begins to call on the name of the Lord. So she raised Seth up again, just like she did with Adam, or just what she did with Abel and Cain. And we see that Seth is the one who is going to carry on the family line and carry on the Lord's principles and call out and worship him. This is going to be the son that is going to be seen in the genealogy of Jesus in Luke 3 verse 38, carrying on that family line in order for God to do what he promised Eve in the very beginning, and that's bring about the Messiah. He is going to come into the world. They don't know how many generations this is going to take. And we are going to go on that journey together each and every video. So I hope to see you again. I want you to have a wonderful, wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.